Well, hello, Bible Love listeners. Today is Thursday, October 24th, or October 21st, excuse me. I've got the wrong date. But tomorrow is Friday, October 22nd. And because I love to embarrass him, it is my partner in crime and co-host of the Bible Love podcast, Alan Bentrup's birthday tomorrow. He is younger than me, but as I always tell people, I look a lot younger than he does. So happy birthday, Alan. And we're going to start with a prayer for you. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Also with you.
Oh God, our times are in your hand. Look with favor, we pray, on your servant Alan as he begins another year. Grant that he may grow in wisdom and grace, and strengthen Alan's trust in your goodness all the days of his life. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Happy birthday,
Amen.
Alan. We love you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And today we are joined by the Reverend Dixon Kinser, who is the rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Dixon and I have a long history. We knew each other from the Diocese of Tennessee and worked together in the Diocese of North Carolina. And he is my friend, a great guy, and a scholar. I mean, but in a scholar, a way that we can all understand. And Dixon is not going to go over our heads today, I know. But you are here, Dixon, to wrap up Joshua with us, which has been an interesting journey. Joshua, I don't know about you, Alan, but like I had not spent a lot of time in Joshua before, so this is all sort of a new thing for me. So we had to bring on a lot of guests. We brought on Greg Farron, we brought on Cynthia Bridge Kittredge. We were like, we're not handling this by ourselves. So now we've got Dixon. So welcome, Dixon. So glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really, it's truly an honor to be part of this like collection of episodes on Joshua. Although I did find it interesting that like Greg gets like Jericho and the Jordan River, and Cynthia Kittredge gets the overview, and they're like, let's give all the like really technical real estate allocations to Dixon. You know,
only because we knew you could handle it, Dixon. We knew.
It's as if somebody walks up and is like, here are the terms and conditions pages from your Apple software upgrade. Preach this.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
That's what this part of Joshua feels like.
We love to give you a challenge, Dixon. So welcome and glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. No, it really is. It's super cool. And I'm honored. I was, we were talking beforehand. I mean, this section of Joshua is, it's basically like the time when they're divvying up all of the lands that they've taken over. If you've been listening to the podcast before, we sort of talked about all of the structure of the book as a whole, and this is like the last chunk of it, which is basically, 8 chapters of real estate allocation with very little narrative, and then 2 farewell speeches. But the thing that I always find interesting about the Hebrew Bible is like it's written to be meditation literature. So like you can read it at first pass and kind of catch what's going on. You're like, yeah, I got it, got the story, got the flow. But when you start to get down like layers deeper and you get granular with it, there's all these details that actually illuminate new truths and like deeper things. So I was thinking about pointing some of those out that I thought were interesting.
Yeah.
If that sounds like
Absolutely.
something we would do on the Bible Love podcast. So like, I think the first thing is my section starts with Joshua, basically telling the people, okay, I'm getting old. It's time to divvy this thing up. But then very quickly is like, however, we haven't quite taken all of it over yet. And so there's this element throughout this whole section of Joshua that you sort of recognize it's not a completed task, which goes to some of the the anxiety people have about, is it history, is it not? And it's theological history. It's like this it's a kind of literature that we don't engage with all the time. And so but when they're going through all these like allocations of this tribe gets this and you get this section here and this there, what you start to see is there's all these like callbacks to different stories from earlier in Torah. And so it's kind of cool. It's like at the end of Survivor when they used to like walk by all their fallen tribe mates, on the way to the last tribal council. That's sort of what this is. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Great. I like it.
So that was kind of cool. You get Caleb's allotment in this, and that's significant because Joshua and Caleb are like the two spies that when they go into the land, come back and are like, we can do this. Let's take it. Let's follow God's directive. And so his portion and allotment is part of that reward. Here's what's interesting about Caleb, and this will be germane to some stuff I want to say at the end if we get to it, is that his dad is a Kenizzite, which the history of that tribe, it's an old Canaanite tribe. So Caleb, even though he's an Israelite, his heritage, he's got this like dubious lineage, which is completely consistent with like your Rahab energy from earlier in the book. It's like the faithful outsider. His name in Hebrew means dog and kind of good-hearted or heart. So there's this like the tribe of Caleb was represented by a dog. They used to think in like an ancient world in totems, and that also he's like the kind of the outsider that shows the heart of the faithful Israelite, so already, and as has been the case, God is like, this whole thing is bigger than blood. It's always going to be about more tribes than just y'all. You're going to be the tribe for the other tribes. And that's kind of baked into the story the whole time through.
Oh, I'm so interested to learn more about Caleb. I feel like I forget this stuff from seminary, or maybe nobody taught it to me. I don't know. But like I was all into Rahab last time. Now I'm into Caleb. I wonder if a lot of people name their dogs Caleb. Have y'all thought about that?
My very first parish, I was a youth minister, and I had somebody ask me about Caleb, and they wanted to name their kid Caleb, and I was like, yeah, that's a Bible name. I didn't think about it, and they named their kid Caleb. Had I been asked that question today, I might have led with, in Hebrew, it does mean dog. Which, depending on how you feel about dogs, could be good or bad.
Right. Super.
I just name my kids after athletes and superheroes. I don't worry about biblical names.
I knew Dixon and Alan would enjoy each other. They both have a superhero comic.
I see Thor's hammer.
Yes.
Mjolnir prominent.
Okay. What else
All
you
right.
got for us?
So there's this whole thing through this section where you're, again, at a more kind of granular level, you find these like throwaway verses that feel like it's just like a random detail. But when you take it in the scope of this whole thing, especially if, depending on how you arrange Joshua, if it goes kind of with Torah or with the history books, has an interesting kind of interpretive overlay. But like in chapter 16 and 17, you get these stories where the land is given away, and then it says stuff like, they did not dislodge the Canaanites living in Gezer. To this day, the Canaanites live among the people of Ephraim, right? So they're still there in a lot of these places. And then it says, and they were required to do forced labor. The same happens with the Manassites. They go through, there's still Canaanites there, and they don't drive them out, but they make them do forced labor, which of course is interesting for the people whose God is Yahweh, because why? They were slaves. And already here, they are making other slaves. And that is sort of like if this was a movie, it's like bum, 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 and like the lighting gets dark, and what's going to happen, of course, because they're writing this, most likely in exile, but it's certainly way after the time that their own nation has fractured, is they're going to be like, yeah, part of our problem was Solomon oppressed our own people to build the temple of Yahweh. Like that they know that part of their story. And so those things getting kind of laid into these details is super important and interesting to me. So it's kind of like there's this whole like faithful, not faithful thing in this part. It's like drive out the Canaanites, except we totally almost didn't,
The theme we
be
a lot here in Joshua, right? I mean, Alan, I mean, all of them, right? All of this faithful, not faithful, faithful, not faithful, which, I mean, I'm not sure I would be either after seeing all this stuff going on. I mean, I can kind of like relate to them a little bit, right?
And I think in Joshua goes to great lengths to kind of overplay God's faithfulness, if you can overplay God's faithfulness. But he really hammers home everything God promised has come true. Like, has it? Maybe. But then on the flip side, is that a way to say, we're not holding up our end of the bargain? And you think about this, right? Like, yeah, it's like 10 chapters of real estate contracts. But these are people that were, if there's anyone still alive that was in bondage, or people who were born in slavery, or people who were born when you're wandering. So these are people that have never had land of their own. So what's the first thing they do when they're presented with land of their own? Is they try to conquer it and get more land. And so like, even when they're given this gift, and land was everything back then, and it still is today. But even when folks were given this by God, it doesn't seem like it's enough.
Yeah. It's such a good point, Alan. And it's like, it's part of why, like when you get to these farewell addresses at the end, like in chapter 24, Joshua, he's giving them this whole like, be faithful to God or it's not going to go well for you. This is like the big thing he wants them to know. And it's where like the verse that everybody quotes from Joshua, if you don't know Joshua, is like, be strong and courageous, or as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, and it's like usually in cross stitch over someone's front door, or when I lived in Nashville, the YMCA had all these like banners on the wall with like Bible verses that they thought related to exercise. And so you would have like, like be strong and courageous, and this guy is like bench pressing, or, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And like these two dudes are like curling this, these huge muscles. So it's like, I feel like that verse gets the like out of context treatment a lot. And when you throw it in context, it's another faithful, not faithful. Because It's like, there's all these other houses that are like, yeah, we're going to not do the Yahweh thing. I'm feeling pretty sure we're going to go over here and do Canaanite gods, because like that's what our neighbors are doing, and the kids love the youth group, and so we should just probably go.
And intermarriage was a problem, and so maybe these Canaanites were cute, and right, and
yes,
I was a teenager that went to a church because of my girlfriend and all of that, right? Like that's been a problem for a really long time, apparently.
I'm telling you,
we're
it's
not
exactly
the first one, Alan. We're not the first one.
So I mean, I just think all that stuff it becomes really interesting, and it's thematically cohesive. I mean, it's tedious to read, maybe even for ancient peoples, but like it's about the fulfillment of this promise that God made a long time ago. And here it is, and it happened, and we did it. But the people that are inheriting it are fraught with sin, just like everybody else. And it's gonna ultimately, as they know, it's not going to go well for them.
And Dixon, I think that's really important too, because when we're reading the Bible, sometimes we're like, oh, this is so tedious. This feels like real estate paper, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But I love you have found the excitement in it. You've found that, like, not just the excitement, but also like, this is actually important for us to understand, and it's not just like, oh, let me skip that part, because that sounds like, I was telling them before, my Gordon Fee thing was like, this is not an interesting part of Joshua, but but I appreciate that the lens you're bringing to it is important, because it's all important in how we read it and how we understand it and how we interpret it. And this was people's lives, and what they were going through at the time, and trying to get our heads around that and what that means. And that's important for us to understand our history.
And real estate contracts are not interesting until your neighbor wants to build a garage that's going to end up on your property.
Then
and
it
then you're
very
become super interested in where the property line is.
Exactly. Yeah. So much for bringing that. Now, you said before we started that you had some good comparisons that you wanted to do.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about violence, or do you want to talk about Jesus?
Let's talk about violence and Jesus.
Violence. Yeah.
Okay, let's do that. So I, having listened to the other episodes, I loved that in every one of them, the podcast has addressed the Canaanite conquest. And is it a genocide? Is it not? Like how to talk about it, the lessons to take from it, and the things not to take from it, like and just really good kind of layered and nuanced stuff. And one of the things that I kept finding myself feeling as somebody that walks people through this in a parish is I get questions about this kind of stuff a lot from people that either are like, this is why I don't read the Bible, because it's so backward and archaic, and it's, we can't really give any sort of credibility or authority to a story where the main character kills a whole bunch of people because they're living on his perceived property. Or people that are like, I feel like this is kind of rattling my faith with regard to the authority claims that I give to the Bible. Because isn't it like the word of God? Isn't, and so there are, y'all have done a good job of kind of pulling apart some of the, the things with the authority claims. And I think particularly the way Anglicans read the Bible that make it, here's the truth of it, that can be dismissed from the historicity or whatever. But the violent stuff is a problem, and it's weird. And so some of the things I wanted to just add to kind of further complexify engagement with violence in Joshua and kind of biblical violence. The first is to remember that in the ancient world, this was totally how tribes established themselves. And Alan, I think you said that in one episode, and to really underscore that this is written, about a time and place that we're not familiar with, but 100% in 4,000 years, if human beings are still on this planet, they're going to look at 2021 and be like, you did what? Mm-hmm. There will be stuff that feels primitive and barbaric. So there's always a way that I want to try to circumvent the chronological snobbery that comes when you look at a text like this. Mm-hmm. The other is, I think it's important that God, in giving this command, and there's a scholar named John Walton that points this out, God isn't go commit genocide. God says drive them out, right? Now there's other language that I'm going to get to in a second that is more intense, but it's a different kind of thing than kill them all, God sort them out. It's the sense of the problems were the lifestyles of the Canaanites were deeply destructive, again, hashtag Leviticus, they wouldn't have had to write it down if it wasn't a problem in the community. So these are things that are not good for human beings, and they're flourishing in God's new world. And so it's we don't want to have this as part of it. So Walton's sort of when you read these stories, yes, they're primitive, yes, they're barbaric, but it's a lot more how do we get rid of this destructive culture, not this destructive people? Even though, yes, it's a horror show of violence. But I think that's a complexity that you have to be able to hang with in these ancient texts.
Really important distinction, Dixon, too. It's not the people, it's the acts that we need to concentrate on. And we, Alan, this is Alan's imagery, but we love to talk about the shampoo bottle and all the things that were written on the side of it. These things happen because somebody did it, and we need to figure out how to not do it anymore, right? And
yes,
kind of look through it in that lens, I think is super important. So thank you for that distinction.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting that in there, like, this is not this is to Alan's point too, it's not an unbridled, like, just go have at it. It's like there are boundaries to the conquest that are given. It's like, don't go farther than this, don't do this. This is how you're to deal with prisoners of war. This is that, which, yes, it's like totally crazy and primitive to think about today. But like back then, that was like progressive. It was radical. This was like the liberals are showing up and being like, what if we don't kill everybody?
Right.
And the places they're attacking, there was always peace on offer, and they're military outposts. They're not cities, which again, a granular level just starts to reveal a different kind of picture that is harder to see. I don't want to come across like I'm saying, and this is why it was good that all those people died. Like, that's,
I think you're giving us really good context in reading it, like to understand some of the details in this. Not that we're like, everybody go out and kill everybody, but like the understanding behind it. And that's really helpful to me.
because it's like you have to read the literature on its own terms, which, all right, to the last part that I found really interesting in this is that there's this whole genre in here of like in the ancient world of battle idioms, and the way that basically conquerors would talk about their own conquest is they would use like really extreme and hyperbolic language to like elevate what the victor had done and show like how much they dominate. It's basically like pro wrestling. They're like, I'm gonna come in there, Tony Schiavone, and I'm gonna tear your arms. Like, they use these kind of like big, loud, violent images to describe how in charge they're going to be. And the ancient world did this a lot. We have idioms today like raining cat and dogs. We don't think that means that. But when you encounter this stuff and you see God give commands to the people in Deuteronomy to like nothing was left alive that breathes, or it was totally destroyed, or they left no survivor. Well, actually the same things were said about Israel by like particular Egyptian pharaohs. There's one from 1200 who boasts of like this military victory over Israel, and it's on a tablet, and it says that Israel was totally laid to waste, his seed is not. Right? Well, that's not what happened. Like, Israel's still here, So it's this like, it's basically ancient trash talk. It's like they're talking smack. Yeah. And that's like some of the language that's in here. We approach it for a lot of different reasons as if it's literal, but its function is actually to just sort of talk about how in charge God is over all these plans. It doesn't mean they really went in and nothing was left alive that breathes, so to speak.
Really helpful. All right, Dixon, we do have a little bit of time, so tell us about Jesus.
All right.
in 2 minutes or less.
All right. And I feel like I've been talking to you, but where's the conversational part of Bible love?
No, I know. You've had such great things to say. We're loving it.
All right. My super nerdy Jesus thing is this. All right. So basically, Jesus's name is Joshua, right? And so when Jesus shows up, like he's wrapping the Joshua imagery around himself. He's doing this for all the parts of Israel's story. It's like he takes 12 disciples, like the 12 tribes, but like he gets baptized in the Jordan River, right? Like, this is Joshua's place. Where he goes into the wilderness is where Jericho was. So he's playing with the Joshua imagery a lot, which should tell us something, at least in the Christian tradition, about what the place of violence is in God's kingdom. Because if Jesus is like the new Joshua that's like leading us into following God's promises, and he's the new Moses that's like showing us the way to the new heaven and new earth and the redemption of all creation and the liberation of all peoples, well, then the fact that he comes in taking the punch and not throwing it has to tell us something about how we read violent stories in the Old Testament, but also the fact that he's born poor and marginalized and victimized is like, oh yeah, evil can't be defeated through its own methods. Which is also a point that the new Halloween movie makes, if you want to go see that. We can talk about that another time. So that's kind of one thing, but it should make you ask, like, well, if this kind of these conquest narratives aren't commensurate with the way Jesus of Nazareth engages, and like the way that Jesus dies on the cross and takes the evil of the world on himself, like, don't you think somebody would have mentioned it in somewhere in the New Testament? It feels like a really big thing that's just hanging out there that doesn't get addressed, unless it does. All right, so here's the nerd. Matthew 15 has got this story that you're familiar with about Jesus, and this woman approaches him out in the hinterlands, whose daughter's possessed by a demon, right? And she says, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter's possessed by a demon, and Jesus doesn't answer her, right? And then when he does answer her, she keeps carrying on. The disciples try to send her away. And he says to her finally, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. So she comes and kneels before him and says, it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs. And Jesus says to her, and then she says, yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. And then Jesus is like, oh my gosh, woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted. Okay. So this story in Mark is ascribed to a Syrophoenician woman. In Matthew, it's ascribed specifically to a Canaanite woman. All right. Which is interesting because that's the only reference to the Canaanites in the entire New Testament. And so you're like, wait a minute, that's an interesting detail. What's that about? And so you start to press down and you're like, all right, so first off, like, the Canaanites are the ancient enemies of Israel. And so we have the son of David, the victor, interacting with the conquered, the Canaanite woman, right? And there's all these like cues in there about, are they just talking about their contemporary relationship or their past relationship? And this is where the stuff about Caleb's really interesting, right? Because the word dog shows up in this story, right? And you're like, wait, dog, I recognize that. That's like referencing Caleb and all this Joshua stuff. And then there's stuff in there where they are talking about the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Okay, this is, how in the Bible, there are some of the truths that it's communicating come from the story itself, and some of it comes from the structure of how it's laid out. All right, so this story about Jesus and the Canaanite woman comes in between the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. All right. So the feeding of the 5,000 happens where Jesus is distributing bread to all the people. And at the end, the apostles gather up 12 baskets, right? Which 12 is obviously a ring for, the 12 tribes of Israel, right? This is about God's provision of mercy, grace, this kingdom for the 12 tribes, among lots of other things. Then we have this story about Jesus and this Canaanite woman where she wins him over, and the outsider, like Caleb, demonstrates the authentic faith. Who has faith like this in all of Israel, right? She does, the Canaanite, just like Caleb, right? Then the next story is the feeding of the 4,000. And they gather up after that one 7 baskets of bread. Now, it kind of feels like that's a redundant story. You're like, what's this about? Like, why didn't we already do this? Like, is Jesus like, is it an encore? But what's interesting is 7 baskets is a really particular number when it comes to Canaanites, because in Deuteronomy 7, when God tells them to take the land that they ultimately do in Joshua and then allocate in our section of Joshua, there are 7 nations that God says to drive out of that land. One of them is the Canaanites, right? And so there's this way that this interaction Jesus has with the Canaanite woman is an inversion of that relationship, and particularly the conquest that happened, because what you're seeing is that the provision of God isn't just for the 12 tribes of Israel. It really is for the ancient enemies of Israel too, because in Jesus the Christ, there are no more enemies, and all are invited into this kingdom, right? Which is a pretty amazing thing to see how this is like, as the New Testament era, basically the gospel writers wrestling with the legacy of the Canaanite genocide and writing into these gospel stories particular ways to address it, or at least bring some complexity to it.
Fascinating. Like, I mean, I don't even feel like I'm like sitting here thinking, who let the dogs out? I mean, because you just blew it up. That is amazing. And I love that when we think about these harsh stories, things that might feel really hard, like, you know, they're right there in the gospel too, you know, and we don't have to separate the two. It's all God showing us in a lot of different ways, right? Okay, I'm so sorry, but we are past our time and we got to wrap it up, which only means that Dixon, you need to come back again because you were perfect and wonderful. And thank you so much for sharing your love for God's people. Listeners, as always, we love you, but most importantly, God does.